All right. Welcome everyone to the 50th Virtual Roundtable on Measuring Corruption. I keep the name of Roundtable, though it has not been a roundtable for a really really long time, so it's always a bit confusing for new faces. I am your host as always, Joseph Poche Alvarez, here connected from Kyoto, Japan, but I am affiliated with Osaka University. And today I'm very excited. We're featuring finally, after 49 meetings, finally we have Transparency International in the house. It wasn't by design that we waited this long. It just kind of happened by fortune that it was the 50th meeting and the new edition of the CPI was coming out. And I had just talked with Roberto a couple of times last year, a few months back, and I thought this is the perfect opportunity to finally host what is by far the most famous measurement of corruption, and very often as well the most talked about, both in positive and more critical terms. So I'm very happy to have the conversation so that Roberto can answer all our questions and explain the thing that very often stay a little muddled. So we'll have time for that. Before we fully begin, I just want to let everybody know. Again, I mentioned already about the recording. Uh, During Roberto's presentation, please keep your microphones off. Although you are welcome to ask questions and make comments during the presentation, just let me know either by clicking the hand emoji or just raise your hand to camera, and then I will invite you to unmute yourself, and then you can ask Roberto. Do please feel free to actively participate, because again, especially this topic is something that we often read about, and we have our own personal opinions. Uh, so today we have the chance of seeking this clarification that very often are missing. Okay. Other than that, I'll probably just interrupt a couple of times, Roberto, as well with my own questions, but I'll let you then just keep momentum as much as possible. All right, I think that is it. So Roberto, feel free to start your presentation. If you can start, of course, by introducing yourself. I'm sorry that I don't formally do so, although I assume the majority of people present today are familiar with your work as well. But if you could say a few words about yourself, and then you can jump into the presentation fully.
Of course, thank you so much, Joseph. It's an absolute honor to finally be here and on the 50th anniversary of the Roundtable, or the 50th edition. Like it's really great, and I'm happy it finally worked out. Hi everyone. I see some familiar faces already in there, but so my name, for those who don't know me, is Roberto Martínez Kukutschka. I'm originally from Mexico. I have been working at Transparency International as on the area of corruption measurement for the past 9 years. And my background is in political science, economics, and international relations, but I ended up focusing then on comparative politics. My PhD at the Hertie School is in governance. And yeah, I have some background in academia. I've been working now for the NGO sector, but I started as a public official in the Mexican government at the Ministry of Finance, where I was using the internal data sets from the Ministry of Finance to detect fraud and tax evasion. And that's how my journey into corruption measurement, fraud detection, and so on began. So yeah, that's just a little bit about me. And now, as Joseph was saying, let's dig into I guess, the OG measurement tool. I'm a bit self-conscious because I've been following the roundtable for a while, and there's always all of these exciting tools and so on. So now we're going back to the real basics. Like we're going back to not where it all began, but almost, right? So I thought that I would start by, since it's been 30 years of CPI by now almost, I thought I would start with a reflection on why the CPI still matters and why it is still relevant today in 2025. Like I was saying, there's so many things that are going on in the field of corruption measurement. Like, why are we still doing this at Transparency International? Why are we still keeping an eye on perceptions, right? And there are many answers for this, or there are, I think, 4 points that I would like to stress here. The first one is that, as we know from research, perceptions do drive behavior. So we see this in many areas. There's a lot of research on this as well. People really act on what they believe. And as we have seen also, often the perception of whether this person or that person is or is not corrupt ends up affecting, for example, how people vote. And that is in itself, I would say, a very powerful reason to keep an eye on perceptions. The second point is that perceptions can be self-fulfilling. And the way in which you see your government, regardless of what the facts are on the ground, might also affect the way in which you interact with that government, right? And we know, for example, that if you think everyone around you is corrupt and acts in a corrupt manner, then you're also more likely to then act in that way. And one of the areas where I also like to stress that perceptions matter is we had a case, we documented a case in Vietnam, for example, during COVID, where there was this village where people were getting COVID, and there was like child mortality there was like insanely high. And then when we were looking into what happened, turns out that the people in this village, which was a remote village, just had the perception that if they were to go to hospital, they would be asked to pay a bribe. And they are a rural, poor community, so they didn't have the resources to pay this bribe. So just the expectation that they would be asked to pay this bribe was enough to keep them away from hospital, right? Turns out, actually, the hospital was not really requesting bribes. There were no reports of bribes being requested there. But this still led to a real loss of life in this village, right? So in a way, perceptions became like a self-fulfilling issue, and they had a real repercussion on the ground. The third point, and I think we will discuss this a little bit later, but perceptions can also erode legitimacy. And I think many governments have also learned this lesson by now. And that is why I think any anti-corruption strategy also needs to take into account the views of experts, business people, and the general public for it to be a holistic approach against corruption. And finally, perceptions can reshape political incentives. And I think this is also part of the reason why Transparency International keeps producing the CPI. We have examples of how leaders and governments tend to respond to the potential, so to speak, reputational damage that a bad perception or a bad reputation on the CPI could bring you, right? We also know that many risk agencies rely on the CPI, many donor agencies as well. So being perceived as a highly corrupt country does have also economic and political consequences. In addition to this, if you look at the literature and so on, the CPI is consistently, as Joseph was saying as well, one of the most widely cited governance indicators. And now that we have a comparative element over time, I think it's very important to keep producing it. And at TI, it also gives us a lot of visibility. So we have in between 170 and 320,000 views per month on consulting the results. And we just heard from Wikipedia or Wikimedia that the CPI is the most read article on corruption on Wikipedia and serves as a, let's say, gateway to other corruption-related articles. So we also see the CPI precisely as this gateway that people might encounter to be like, oh, this is actually interesting. Let's engage a little bit more with with what's going on and understand corruption better, right? And this is also, the CPI by itself is responsible for around a quarter of all of the coverage that TI gets in the media globally. Joseph, I see your hand, so I'll pass on to you.
Thank you. So I have two questions for each one of the last two slides. So if we could go back one slide, great. So if I understood correctly, and this is something that I try to clarify to people as well. So what you're saying is that perceptions in themselves, they are worth assessing, correct, or measuring. right? Separate from whatever we consider empirical reality. Yes, which I of course
Yes.
I completely agree. Uh, so my first question, and I hope it's not kind of like already going too deep into it. If you had to kind of like evaluate your own tool, right? Like corruption perception index, because people also treat it as a proxy for actual corruption, right? So I mean, understanding that it's based on perception, but kind of like a proxy for actual corruption. Now, because you say that perception themselves are worth evaluating, what would you say that, like, how does the CPI works in terms of addressing perception, but at the same time being a proxy for reality? So would you see this as 50-50, or there's like it should be considered more of one type compared to the other one?
That's a great question. So thanks for that. So um, I don't want to sell the CPI for something that is not. It is in the name that it is a perception metric, right? But what we do know is that it correlates very well, even with some, let's say, hard data on corruption, right? So if you correlate CPI to bribery data, there is a very good correlation between the two. If you correlate it as well to some of the I mean, this is not objective reality, right? But some of the risk indicators as well that you can get from procurement and so on, you see that usually the countries where you have the highest risks according to these tools are also the ones that are scoring lower on CPI. So there is a notion of the reality that seeps into the CPI, right? How much of it that is, I would not be able to tell you, but it is not that the two are completely disconnected. Now, having said that, I think you're very aware that there's also a lot of research into the so-called experience perception gap, right? And I think that is a fascinating research question. We have looked into that one as well. And often what we found out is that the experience perception gap often correlates this issue of bribery or metrics of bribery with the perceptions that we see on the CPI. Of course, the CPI is not bribery alone, right? So if you're looking at certain countries where, let's take Georgia, for example. Georgia is a country that on the CPI is middle of the table. It's exactly stationed at 50, right? The middle of the index. I think if you're aware with what's going on in Georgia, the country went through a process of like administrative modernization and so on in the 90s. And they successfully managed to almost eradicate bribery completely, right? But if you look at what's going on, you still have a lot of oligarchs in the country. There's a lot of influence of business on politics. Politics at the very top are not necessarily the cleanest. So for that reason, if you were to just see, okay, we have zero bribery in Georgia, but the CPI is telling us a completely different story. Like, why aren't we higher, right? I think when you have this experience perception gap, rather than just blaming this on a methodological flaw of the CPI or a conceptual problem with it, it's important to dig deeper into what's actually causing this, right? Because it could be, as I'm saying right now, there are more types of corruption than just bribery. You can be looking at maybe patronage. You could be looking at issues in, embezzlement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So I think often people are quick to dismiss the perception indicators without really digging deeper into what the triangulation between this and other data can tell us.
Thank you. Before I ask my second question, I would like to invite Emanuela.
Thank you very much.
Wait, Emanuela, you muted yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I hope this does not anticipate discussions that you were thinking of addressing later on. But as you spoke in terms of the different types of corruption and how those can be tracked and can influence people's perception in a way that is relevant to the index and to understanding the phenomenon, then I was wondering. What's the reason behind this awareness you are showing on behalf of Transparency International of the variety of corruptions and how they can influence people and determine, in fact, people's perception and justify this mismatch between hard data and perceptions, and the persistence of the commitment to the definition of corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. So when it is clear that this definition of corruption is fit for certain types of corruption, but not of them. So I was wondering what's the deepest rationale. So I understand that an instrumental reason is securing those cross section and multi-year comparison that you mentioned. Of course, to compare things, you need a common currency. But I was wondering what kind of discussion you're having in terms of how far sticking to this definition creates a tension with the awareness of the different forms of corruption and how they could justify for the mismatch between reality and perception.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, to be perfectly honest, I don't think that the CPI keeps the definition of Transparency International as cleanly as one would think, because basically I think if I like to be completely honest and very frank about this, I think what the CPI did at the time, or the logic behind it, is like, okay, we have this individual indicators of corruption that are scattered across the field, right? So what happens if we put them all together? And does this make sense from a statistical point of view? And then from the technical statistical point of view, everything pointed to the fact that, yeah, actually this gives you a robust composite indicator of corruption by aggregating these metrics, and it adds some value, right? I don't think we started the conversation from the definition part. I think many of the newer indicators do that. But as a result of this, what the CPI does is not just say, okay, we define corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. Rather, what the CPI does is incorporate different manifestations of corruption, or the perception of different manifestations of corruption, into this single metric, right? And then we still have a TI, so moving away from the tool, so to speak, we do have the definition that you're talking about, but we're, I think, very aware of the fact this is not the only thing that matters. So we have developed other areas of work. This is unfortunately, I think that definition and the CPI are the stickiest things TI has ever produced. So they just keep being cited everywhere. And then you just have basically, if you have a media article on corruption, it will have the definition by TI and the CPI score of whatever country, right? So it's not that we're not evolving and that we don't have additional definitions for issues like grand corruption, like state capture, money laundering and other phenomena, but it's just not as, I would say, popular as what you see, right? So these discussions are happening, but I guess they don't often get to the public eye, or they are not as visible. Yeah, I saw another hand. So of course, Joseph, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So I also just wanted to add the point about that, to plug Emanuela's most recent paper. It's very interesting about conceptual engineering and corruption. She has, of course, worked on a new definition of corruption, which I paraphrase as deficit of accountability in public office. I'm sorry, that's not exactly the wording. But again, it's a very interesting discussion connected to how would corruption look like, if we change the definition. As you know, Roberto, I personally adopt the Transparency International definition, especially in comparison to the World Bank. So that discussion about how it relates to the indicators that the CPI builds on, yeah, I was really intrigued by that. But the question that I had is about the next slide. So I don't know if you could move to the one where you here. Yes. So I would like to know from TI CPI perspective, who are your interlocutors? Like, what are the stakeholders that you see as being the ones who you produce the CPI for? Because you mentioned, yeah, it is indeed the most cited, and it appears every year, and across multiple media, online and physical, and everybody's talking about this throughout the weeks after the release, right? And I just today or yes, maybe today or yesterday, I saw a new article talking about how corporations keep an eye out on this data that it gets released and updated every year. Oh, is Roberto here? Oh, I think he may have dropped off. Oh, let's give him a minute to come back. Oh, let's see. That's unfortunate. Hmm. In the meantime, Emanuela, congratulations for the new paper. I was just talking with my colleagues today about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, very interesting
I
work.
hope it's helpful.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, I also love these conversations about definitions of corruption and its construction. So I think this is really fantastic.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
I'm going to pause the recording and let me send Roberto an email, see what happened there. Okay, and we're back. So. As I was saying, so let me just go back a little bit in that question. So I was saying, right? So there's just this recent article, I think came out today or yesterday, talking about how corporate actors also keep an eye out on CPI's results every year, to update their views on a variety of issues related to their businesses. So it got me wondering about from TI's perspective, who you feel you're speaking to when releasing the CPI and working on the updates of the CPI.
Yeah, so actually, the audience is quite broad. So the target audience is really broad because I guess what we often have in mind is what we want to use this as is an awareness raising tool. So we want, like I was saying, I mean, even in the statistics that I'm citing here, right? We want to reach out to more people. We want more people to engage with the topic. We also want to keep the topic alive in the agenda, in the international agenda. So we want to raise this. I mean, I guess we have a mini anti-corruption day whenever the CPI is launched, right? To make a bit of a media splash and bring some of the important issues that we as a community discuss on a yearly basis on that day. So I think for us, that was the original target audience, right? Then we realized, oh wow, like this tool is actually very widely used. And I'm always surprised to see how widely used it is by businesses, by development agencies, by banks, in the private sector. So I think by now we're also more aware that this is the case. So now we need to, I mean, it is a very delicate balancing act every year to be like, okay, we know that there's going to be questions from governments and policymakers. So you need to do something that speaks to them, right? There's also a lot of, we've also received a lot of input and insights from academics that also use the index, right? So it's also like, okay, we need to also keep them in mind when we report about the index. But in general, I guess our communication strategy is meant to journalists and the general public. But perhaps your question is a bit answered more by my next slide, because in this case, I think we have also managed to, I mean, if I'm speaking a little bit more as an internal audience for Transparency International, which would be the national chapters, what we have also noticed is that the, let's say, fame of the CPI allows them to also open doors with governments and start speaking about, okay, if like you're telling me now that my score dropped by 1 or 2 points, so the next question is, but how do I improve in your score, right? In your index. And I think that is precisely then where the national chapters come in. And then we can have these really important conversations about policy, about what needs to change, about where things are going, and even about corruption measurement, right? Because we never tell them, this is the one indicator that you need to look into, and that's that. Like this is, we also start by telling them that if they want the results of their policies to be reflected in the CPI, they probably need to start producing the evidence that shows that these policies are working, which involves creating a measurement framework for those policies as well, right? So, and examples of impact that I think are important, like at different levels. Last year, for example, when we published the CPI, it received a lot of attention in Portugal because the score had declined a lot. And the president came out with a statement saying that he was very concerned. And then at that moment, also the opposition said, okay, we see eye to eye on this thing. So why not move forward with a reform package? And that's exactly what happened. So 2 days after the CPI was launched, came a reform package. And this is an experience that we have in many other countries as well. And also 2 years ago in Pakistan, the CPI was launched 2 days before the election. And then you start having all of these conversations on the campaign trail about, okay, what are we going to do about corruption if we are to get to power, right? So I think that's also how we use it in many ways. So to start conversations, to open doors, and to start the discussions that I think many of us want to have. So back to you, Joseph, because of course you have more questions.
That's very interesting. I really love this because this is very often the complaint or criticism from a policy making perspective, right? That country get a score, but it's not clear what they can do to reverse that or to improve. But what you're saying is that the score is just the entry point or something that brings attention and allows for countries then to explore how to improve via their local chapter. That, at least for me, that resolve a question that I had for a really long time. But I do wonder here if you also have in mind here the national integrity system assessment, that of course is kind of like a very famous instrument or tool developed by Transparency International. Is this something that also like taps into the CPI to like I don't know if my question makes sense. I just wonder like if this still plays a role in this kind of like support for national governments to improve their CPI.
Yeah, so this is also something that we do, and it's funny that you bring up the national integrity system, because that is one of the most popular requests from national governments whenever we announce CPI. It's like, okay, what could be the next step, and what about this national integrity system assessment? So yeah, that is something that happens often. We also used to have data from the Global Corruption Barometer, right? That used to show, okay, you're clearly struggling with issues of bribery in different sectors. People are also, even though this is a different audience or like a different group, right? Because the CPI is based on the perceptions of experts and business people, but it's also like, sometimes it's disregarded as like, oh, these are the elites. But when you also have to say, well, it's only the elites. We also have the perceptions of individuals that feel more or less the same way. And the concerns are mostly around this or that sector. So that gives you a little bit more granularity. And then, of course, that is only talking about tools that we have at the Transparency International Secretariat that are, I would say, comparative. But there's also a lot more happening at the local level by national chapters that develop their own metrics, their own platforms, their own ways of measuring corruption in different ways that then also feed into the narrative of, okay, what can we do? So I think the CPI in a way is just the tip of the iceberg. And then you can have these conversations later, right? I think often what happens is, since the CPI is so visible, there's this thing of like, okay, how do we improve that one? And then unfortunately, the answer is much more, I mean, it's not that easy, right? You need to do the hard work under the surface. And you also need to start monitoring in different ways and in different areas for you to start showing that progress is being made. So yeah, it's a lot of work at different levels.
Thank you.
So if that's it, I guess we can move a little bit into the methodology. I think I don't need to invest a lot of time on this, but usually the things that I like to remind people, because this is often confused, even though you might think that this, I mean, the CPI has been around for 30 years, how newsworthy can this be? But just to remind everyone, the CPI is a composite indicator. Transparency International does not produce any of the data that goes into it. The national chapters do not produce any of the data that goes into it. This is all produced by completely independent organizations that are not associated to TI. The only thing that we do is put this all together. The second point is that we're only looking at the perceptions of experts and business people, not to disregard public opinion. But this choice was made just because the way in which we needed to choose the sources, there were not that many public opinion surveys that would be updated on as a regular basis as the expert and business surveys. So that's why this decision was also made. And to go back also to the question asked before about like, oh, but corruption is so broad and there are so many definitions, and like the CPI just measures a little bit. Yes. We're focusing only on public sector corruption here, also because we can talk about this later as well. But I think when it comes to the issues of measurement, at some point, you need to draw what might appear as a slightly arbitrary line, right? Of like, what can and can't we measure? There's been a lot of criticism and demands for the CPI to be expanded to also incorporate issues, for example, of civic space, human rights, democracy, anti-money laundering, human rights, like all of these things. And while this might sound like a great idea when you just look at it and be like, okay, I just want to look at that number and it will tell me all the information that I need to know about all of these things, right? Actually, what ends up happening is that you just end up with an even murkier indicator and you don't know what you're looking into. And some of these issues do not necessarily go hand in, I mean, they do not correlate enough to justify the same statistical treatment as the sources that we currently have. So that is, for example, the case of illicit financial flows. They do not necessarily, or they do not correlate with corruption the way, with public sector corruption, the way that some people would expect, right? So that's why these conceptual clarity, I think, on like what goes into the CPI and what doesn't is really important. And this is also to continue on the conversation that we were having earlier, right?
Roberto,
so
sorry for interrupting. We
there's
have
a question,
a
yes.
hand raised. Lizel, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Joseph. And congratulations on pronouncing my name today. I was waiting for that. No, thanks. I think, Roberto, you've answered my question to some extent. If we, you were saying the expert assessments and business surveys, and I was then wondering, you know, if there are so many of those type of assessments and they don't ask necessarily the same questions, which you can now look at globally. So I was wondering, so how do you make sure that you can compare apples with apples if you have all these different surveys? Thanks.
Yeah. That's here. So the logic of the Corruption Perceptions Index, like I was saying, is that not everything that goes into the index is the same thing. right? So we're looking at issues of bribery, embezzlement, diversion of public funds, nepotism. So like the different questions that are in the different sources might look at different aspects of corruption, right? But even though the questions might be phrased differently, even though they might be looking at slightly different phases of corruption, when we look at how they correlate globally, there's a really high correlation between them, which means it doesn't mean they're all the same thing, but it means they're all happening more or less together. And they are all, I would say, describing the same underlying phenomenon. So once you put all of this together, you're getting reliable reading of the perception of what we call public sector corruption here, right? So what you see here, like all of the green boxes are, like this is just the correlation of all the sources that we have, the 13. The green boxes, I color them, those are like high correlation coefficients. The yellow ones are not as strong, and the red ones are weak. The reason the red ones are weak is that we have different geographical coverages between different sources. So sometimes you don't have the same, but for the sake of transparency, I left them here. But as you can see, most of the sources really correlate well with each other, which is what justifies putting them all together into the same index, even if they are not exactly the same thing. So that is, I would say, the statistical and conceptual core of the CPI. So like I said, this started from statistical justification, not like many newer indices that start from a more theoretical and conceptual starting point, right? I hope that answers the question. All right, awesome. So Joseph, go ahead.
Could we go back to the slide that where you were talking about the different types of yes, this one. What does the CPI capture? Sometimes I feel about this one like the $1 million question for the CPI. And I think that partly you already mentioned, like, for example, why the CPI focuses on public sector corruption, because as you mentioned, at some point you gotta draw a line and say, okay, I'm going to cover or focus on this and I'm not gonna cover the other one, right? Uh, but over the last few years, this has brought a little bit of attention. I feel that TI's website explicitly mentioned this point, and every year I think there's an effort to remind people what is included and what is not included. So my question would be, so if there is a clear awareness now about this boundary, why not expand it? Like, I understand why not everything might fit a good definition or a good idea of corruption measurement. For example, tax fraud. I get that point, but there seems to be growing criticism, especially now looking at the situation of corruption in the US, and more recognition about how even Northern Europe is affected by corruption. About why, for example, not including enablers of corruption. So I guess this is a second part to the question. TI did made an effort to focus on a bribery or bribe payers, right? That data was updated until about 10 years ago, and then it kind of got discontinued. Um, has at some point been a conversation about maybe folding those forms of corruption into the CPI, or was it a matter of keeping a consistent methodology across the years for comparison purposes? I would just like to understand like the rationale behind kind of like keeping this boundary where it is and where it's been.
Yeah, I mean, the rationale is, it is twofold. On one hand, we do think that there is power in retaining comparability over time, and I think if we look at the results from this year and like the way in which we communicated the index, now we're trying to bring more attention to the trends over time, rather than, oh, you scored 90 this year, or you scored a 75, right? So I think retaining that is a strong argument for keeping things as they are, but it's not the only one. we have tried, I have ran simulations, for example, of folding into the CPI the like data from Tax Justice Network, for example, on financial secrecy. We have tried to add other sources as well, but in many occasions, like the coverage for this is so like I was saying, the correlation with the sources is not good enough, and then geographical coverage is not the same. So we would end up with an index that for some countries considers two concepts. For some countries, it just considers our core concept of public sector corruption. And then once again, when you try to interpret and read that, it's much more difficult. So it's not that we're trying to be purists and we're against like changing the methodology in any way. No, that is not the case. It's just we haven't really found the data that would allow us to do that. And that's why I guess the way in which we're trying to bridge that issue is by triangulating the data from the CPI with this type of data. So by acknowledging that there are obviously links between enablers and between anti-money laundering regulations and all of these things and corruption. And yeah, I mean, we don't address cross-border corruption either in the CPI, right? It still has this, I would say, legacy interpretation or view of corruption as something that happens within your national borders and that is basically constrained to those national borders. I think there is still some merit in that definition, but of course, I think there is now the need for measuring also these other flows and these other types of corruption. But I don't think a global index like the CPI is necessarily the best way to do so.
Thank you. That's a very strong argument, that of complementarity and triangulation. It makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you for clarifying that.
My pleasure. Yeah. So in terms of like, if we're going to go back to the methodology, it's a fairly straightforward aggregation process where we just have the sources that we have selected based on a set of criteria. They are, like I said, expert or business surveys. They are updated on a regular basis of every 1 to 2 years. They cover a representative sample of countries across diverse regions to allow for comparability. And they come from reputable organizations and have a methodology that has remained stable over time. So once we have that set of sources, also to mention, there are not that many sources that actually fit that bill. So this is also what restricts us in a way. We proceed to the standardization process, which is just relying on the standard deviation of the data and the mean to come up with z-scores and then rescale this into the CPI scale. And the CPI, the final CPI, is just the simple average of all of the sources that we have for each country. We provide a CPI score if we have at least 3 sources per country. Of course, this affects also the reliability of the indicator and the metric for the different countries, which is why we are now also trying to draw more attention to the standard error of the index or the measure of uncertainty that we publish with it, and why we are now trying to be also more proactive in telling people, do not overinterpret changes of 1 point or 2 points up or down from this year to last year, because it is very likely that this is just caused by statistical noise. If you see that the trend of -1, -2 points goes on for perhaps 2-3 years in a row, then I think you can start talking about a potential red flag of like, okay, something's off, right? But at TI, we are now only talking about change in the CPI score if the change is outside the margin of error or the confidence interval. So if it is statistically significant, which, yeah, I guess that's how we are trying to, I guess I already covered this and we already jumped to this. So yeah. And as a final point, perhaps on the methodology, we have also submitted the CPI methodology to independent statistical audits. The last one was conducted by the European Commission's Joint Research Center. They audited the assumptions, the statistical approach, the sources, and all of this. And the result was basically to say, okay, it makes sense to aggregate these data sources. It makes sense that based on the correlation, we are looking at an underlying phenomena. It makes sense that by doing this, we're getting a more reliable read of what corruption would be like in these countries than if we were just to look at each one of these sources in isolation. And the other strength of the CPI is that you can also see, just based on the, because we also publish this, just on the spread of the data, whether there is agreement or disagreement amongst sources of where the country is, right? And often this is also, I think, a very strong piece of evidence of where a country stands, right? Sometimes we also see that there are disagreements between the sources that are based on expert perceptions and the ones that are based on business surveys. So I think that also tells you something about where things are going. So there's a little bit more under the hood than just the score itself. Go ahead, Joseph.
Yes, I come to bring a question by David Sotola. I don't know if David, maybe you'd like to unmute yourself and ask it, or otherwise I'll read it for you.
Okay, hello.
Hello.
Yes, my questions are actually two. The index is quite sticky, you know. Countries have been on around the same score for decades, and so it's, you know, I now wonder what is your view, firstly. Secondly, whether you think the index itself, given that it's quite the same, you know, is it not kind of you know, measuring something else? That would be my first question. The second question is about the CPI gets a lot of criticism here and there. So what is the typical, you know, your response to this criticism?
Yeah, so on your first question, yeah, the CPI is quite sticky. And it has been around for a long time. I think it's good to see the CPI next to other indicators that are now emerging. I think it is really great to see that this is happening. And many of the indicators that Joseph has presented here, has hosted here at the roundtable, I think are great advances. And I think there is space in this field for all of this data. And our role, I mean, I wish that my role would be making sense of what all of this is telling us, rather than just having to produce the data and trying to get up with like, okay, so how do we assess this now? How do we measure this? I wish I had the problem of too much data rather than too little. But also, I think many of the tools that are emerging and that we see, for example, the very popular data, like work with data on procurement and with public databases and so on, require a ton of data, information, and computational capacity that not all countries have. So what we have in the CPI is a very, I would say, modest but powerful first point of contact to assess where things are all over the world. And it's, in a way, sad to say, but it is still the case that often the CPI is the only data point that we'll have to assess corruption in many countries, right? Especially if you look at smaller countries where, like, I don't know, Central America or the Pacific or many other places, you don't really have that much information about these places. And this is the one point that that they will have, which is also why they try to use it for evaluating policy. And what then, like, the discussion becomes, okay, how do we improve on the CPI, and why didn't our reform from last year improve on like carry us forward in the index, you know? So I think that is my response to many of the criticisms. It's like the CPI was never meant to be the sole tool to assess anti-corruption progress, or the one tool to conquer them all. It was never meant to be this is the one number that tells you everything you need to know about a country. That is not the way in which we see it. And like I said, I think you said it yourself, David, it is so sticky and so visible that it might seem that this is the only thing Transparency International does, but that is not the case. So as like we always tell people to look deeper, and to also triangulate with other sources of data. And if there's no other data on corruption, maybe you also need to look at other governance angles, right?
And I actually think that the fact that the CPI is a correlates with quite a number of other indicators is very positive for CPI.
Yeah. So, and that's what we're also trying to say. As TI, also what we're trying to use the CPI for is to put forward some, to also test in a way some of the assumptions that we had in the past. And I think the CPI, even if like sometimes internally, can be controversial. So when you start seeing, for example, some authoritarian regimes rising on the index, when like your theory of change is that democracy is good for anti-corruption, it's like, how is this happening? How is this possible, right? And then it's also interesting to see that like the results in the CPI challenge you to say, okay, maybe democracy is not the only way, and it is important for us to also look into what these countries are doing and recognize that even though we want to see, ideally, at least I think that is the view from Transparency International, that and my personal as well, that an anti-corruption policy that relies not only on top-down reforms, but also bottom-up involvement, right, that includes civil society, free media, and so on, is likely to be more successful and sustainable in the long run. There are things that governments have done with just top-down reforms that do work to tackle certain forms of corruption, for example, bribery, right? And that is something that I think the CPI allows you to show. And the CPI has been evidence that this is also happening, right? So that's why I think there is power in two things: triangulation and the trends that we see over time, rather than just the annual ritual, I would say, almost, of just publishing the CPI, if that makes sense. So if there are no questions, I would like to share with you as well, not necessarily a rundown of the results, but maybe some of what I said we're trying to do differently now. So as of this year, if we look back at where the world was in 2012, we have identified a total of 81 countries where the scores are now statistically different from where they were in 2012. Unfortunately, 50 of those 81 countries are worsening. So the scores are worse than what they were back in 2012. And only 31 are improving. And I think what is interesting to see here is where the improvement is happening as well. And like I said, this is a very colorful collection of countries. And what we see is that progress is happening at basically all levels of the socioeconomic or economic development of a country, right? You have some very low-income countries that have made great progress, and you see also like very rich, stable democracies that are backsliding. So I think there are important lessons to be learned across the whole distribution of the index. And one of the insights that we got this year is that actually at the top of the index is where we see the most backsliding. So many of the Western democracies are actually now worse off than what they were in where they were in 2012. The CPI alone cannot tell us what this is happening. So that's why you need to look into, okay, what is happening? What are the other indicators? What is happening in these countries? And the explanation that TI got from, we think that what's happening here is that, as we were discussing before, corruption changes. The challenges have also changed. There's more pressure now also on Western European countries and Western nations to control corruption, and challenges that they didn't have 10, 15 years ago are now becoming more real. in the sense that many of the Western democracies are trust-based societies. They did not have regulation on conflict of interest. They did not have regulation on lobbying. They did not have regulation on many things that that in the past few years have served for scandals like Qatargate or many other scandals of foreign or even business influence in politics, right? So we think we think that very likely this is one of the trends that is behind what's happening in these countries. So they need to really pay some more attention to updating their anti-corruption frameworks and their anti-corruption arsenal, so to speak, because it appears, at least according to perceptions, not to be up to par anymore. And this is what we see as well if we compare just the distribution of scores over time. So here the blue line is the 2025 distribution vis-a-vis the orange reddish line that is 2012. And what we see is, some things have shifted, right? And we have seen some declines at the bottom. These are mostly explained by conflicts that spark up, or democracies that collapse and become authoritarian regimes, and so on. So here you have cases like Syria, like Sudan, like Yemen, Venezuela, and so on. So these are like really, I would say, states in a fragile situation, like fragile states that remain in conflict or are just post-conflict. But we see a lot of interesting stuff happening in the, I would say, low 20s to mid 30s of the index, in the sense that many of the countries that were here in 2010 have started to make gains and moving towards the average point or the midpoint of the index at around 50. And this, we think, has been, or what we see here has been the result of consistent reform over time. In many countries at this point, there has been a lot of push to digitalize a lot of many public services, which has actually brought down bribery rates in many countries. And we think this is partly what is going on there. At the same time, we also see, like I was saying, some of the countries at the very top of the index sliding back, what we think is due to this lack of updating and care for their anti-corruption frameworks. Yes, go ahead, Joseph.
If you could go back to the previous slide that you were showing us. Yes, this one. Thank you. Just to clarify, so the comparison is to 2012 because of the methodological update that happened around that time, correct? Could you just say something very briefly, perhaps for those of us or those watching the video later on YouTube that may not be aware of the change that happened about 15 years ago?
Yeah, so the CPI was born in 1995, but at the time, the way in which the data was being aggregated did not allow for comparison over time. This did not stop many people from doing that, which was also a criticism at the time. But TI was very clear to say this is not comparable over time, do not use it, but people were still using it. So in 2012, there was a methodological revision that allowed then for comparison over time. But the scores that were there before 2012 were not back calculated. So now we only have comparable data from 2012 onwards. So what I am doing here is comparing the earliest possible date with the latest data that we have, right?
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that we cross all the T's and dot all the I's.
Makes sense. Thank you for that. And yeah, this is the final part of like what TI has been doing or trying to do differently with the CPI. So for the past 9-10 years, we have been using the CPI to sort of build a narrative of like, okay, what is behind these trends and how does the CPI or what we see in the CPI and corruption connect to other issues? Because the solutions that countries need to work with will not come from looking at the CPI alone. You need to understand what's going on under the hood. So you need to look into democracy, civic space, inequality, perhaps, human rights, what is the situation with justice, conflict, peace, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we've been trying to take more of a thematic angle for some time. And this year, what we try to do is like take some of the lessons and narratives that we have developed over those years to sort of bring it all together more as in a way, a dashboard, right? And we're just going to keep an eye on these variables in the near future. So what we're seeing, and this is, as I think David was also saying, the CPI correlates very well with many metrics, which also helps us in a way get some external validity for the results. So what we're seeing is, it will not surprise anyone in this call that if you look at just CPI averages by regime type, full democracies, or what we would consider full-fledged democracy, still perform the best in the index. There are some outliers, of course, in all of the groups, but on average, this is still the case. However, we do see, if we compare over time, we also see that the average for democracies is slowly falling. So that's also to go with a trend that I was saying before. And the other thing that we looked into is like, okay, what is the issue with civic space? Because especially I think now there's been a lot of pressure all over the world on civic freedoms, civic space, and so on. And what we saw as well when looking at the index is that in almost 2/3 of the countries where we see decline, this decline has been accompanied by a pattern of restriction in the freedom of expression, assembly, association, and so on. And as anecdotal evidence, for example, I think the past 4 or 5 years have been the period where Transparency International has had to either shut down the biggest number of chapters in history or move them into exile, right? So it became impossible to work in environments like Russia. It's increasingly difficult to work in Georgia, also Vietnam, Cambodia, many places where we were working in 2012, we no longer have presence, right? So this is just what I had as a wrap up. So if you're going to take anything out of my presentation, I hope it is that perceptions matter because they drive real life behavior. That comparisons over time can provide robust evidence of what is going on and serve as a warning. That declines in CPI and challenges in corruption are not just confined to low performance, that actually some low performers have managed to do things against corruption, and that democracy and civic space remain central for anti-corruption. At the same time, remember that CPI is just like an early warning benchmark. It works better when paired or triangulated with other sources as well. Transparency International does not see it as the absolute truth, and neither do I. So I hope I will just leave that there. And I think I see some hands and questions. So over to y'all.
Roberto, before we start the Q&A, could you maybe stop sharing your screen so we can see everyone?
Of course.
And that way we can have a more comfortable little chat. All right, sure. So let's open the Q&A with Emanuela. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I was wondering my question is on the last part of your presentation and the correlation you found in the variations of in CPI and other elements. So as Joseph mentioned earlier on, my research mainly comes from accountability studies. So I was wondering what measures, what space you give to accountability mechanisms and correlation between the index and the presence improvement changes in accountability measures in the public sector of the different countries, and where this element of accountability shows, because that seems to be particularly important. You also mentioned trust, the level of trust in institutions. Of course, they can come from citizens' perception not part of the index, but of course, trust also is a matter of internal trust, no? And so people working for institutions being able to trust that their work can actually go somewhere and corruption does not divert it. So I was wondering whether you could expand a little more on that. And of course, I'm always more particularly interested in the rationale for choosing certain ways of considering or not considering accountability.
Yeah, thank you for that. So actually, we try to bring in the accountability angle in the solutions part of the whole thing. And because we think that strengthening those mechanisms is key to improve on the index. So for that reason, usually our recommendations is precisely that. It's like you need to work on strengthening the oversight mechanisms, on strengthening checks and balances, but also, as you're saying, then in other potential accountability, more like vertical and horizontal accountability mechanisms, right? So the two of them comes to us as part of the solution. And I think at TI, sometimes the understanding of corruption and accountability is so close to one another that we don't see the difference in many ways. So that's why there's been a lot of pressure to say, okay, why don't you include this in the index? Like just put it in there already. But I think, like, again, this has been tried. I did run some simulations on this. But again, so statistically speaking, it doesn't make much sense. And I also think conceptually, I mean, feel free to disagree with me. You know more about this than I do, since your research is about accountability mechanisms. But I think, yeah, we see that as part of the solution and what needs to be changed to then move the CPI rather than put them in there. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, no, it does. I mean, of course, it's always a matter of seeing the positive and the negative, no? So it's in terms of the relation between the two. So if it is true, and you find me in complete agreement with you, that anti-corruption requires strengthening accountability, and that might mean many things, no? Because of course you can have sort of very traditional retrospective views of accountability, but also there's also this dimension of fostering sort of preemptive measures, no? Just fostering an ethics of accountability in institutions such that does not necessarily answer for when corruption happens, but helps to make sure that corruption doesn't happen in the first place. I agree that all this conversation is interesting in terms of what to do next to curb corruption. But then, if that's true, then also conceptually it means that corruption is, in a sense, the contrary of accountability. So measuring accountability deficits, no, and including in the index what indicators of accountability are not present, then is itself it seems to make sense, no, in terms also to track where corruption is, and not only how corruption could be curbed. So that's perhaps where the space also, if very clear indicators of what accountability requires are identified, and those are included in the index, that could make sense. But then, of course, there's the issue of what data are available, and that's the main concern.
Exactly. So that's why we try to bridge this issue, not statistically, but narratively, if that makes sense. So acknowledging that this is important and that they go hand in hand, but statistically we cannot have it in the same pot, right? So that's what we're trying to do with this. These like correlations and the narrative report, like bring a little more attention and raise awareness on that issue.
So I would like to ask more of, I guess, a meta question concerning how the community itself uses the CPI. As you yourself mentioned, regardless of warnings and caveats presented by Transparency International, since its launch, academicians have been pretty much using the data to run all sorts of correlation and testing hypotheses. Again, despite of the warnings about how to deal with this year-to-year comparison, right? So in a large part, the methodological update of 2012 was meant to deal with that. Although even after the methodological change, I remember a couple of blogs by Matthew Stevenson kind of still pointing out that it still doesn't resolve the issue. So now being in 2026, I wonder how TI sees the use of the CPI data by scholars for academic research. Is this something like it's always nice to attract attention, of course, but I do wonder how you guys feel about this being used to test hypotheses and have academic and real world ramifications in terms of how people interpret those results. Is that something that you feel comfortable with, or what messages would you still give to researchers today?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, of course, we're delighted to see that the CPI is useful to more than just one, as you were asking at the beginning, one target audience, right? And I think it's also very telling that academics keep using the CPI for their research out of the lack of other data to test hypotheses, right? So I don't see absolutely any issues in using the CPI academically. What I wish happened more is I wish many academics would really look at the caveats that TI publishes in terms of the methodology, what the CPI can tell you or not, because often I think they don't really look into that. And I have seen some very irresponsible uses of the CPI data, including people that just say, oh, we have absolutely no idea why TI just compares from 2012 onwards. We just took the CPI all the way from 96, multiplied it by 10, and here is the whole data, right? And then the results are shady, and then it's obviously a methodological flaw of the index. So when things go well, it's like great academic work. When things go poorly, it's a methodological flaw on the CPI side, right? So I think it's important as academics and people working in this field to be aware of the limitations of the data that you're using. And that applies to perception data as well as administrative data and like all of the other tools that I mean, many of which you've also hosted here, right? So I think it's important to use this responsibly. I think for comparative assessments, comparative analysis, and so on, it is great. Sometimes I would say people do stretch the definition of the index, and I have seen some very wild uses. I think the wildest one was a paper that estimated corruption based and like linked it to body mass index by using an AI like read of pictures of politicians in Eastern Europe, and then like just determine that the higher the BMI of a politician, the lower the CPI score would be. I don't know what the policy used for that was. I don't know who approved this paper or how it happened, but I wish it hadn't been published.
it got us talking about it though, right?
Yes.
So I see Beatriz raised her hand, but just please, Beatriz, allow me to just do a quick follow-up question to that. Because I think this is a very important point, and you yourself in the graph that you showed, you take us back to 2012, and you basically you're establishing that we can use this data set from 2012 until today for research activities, but we cannot just bundle it with all the data back to 1995, 1996. That wouldn't be appropriate methodologically speaking, right? And I think that's very important to highlight. I do wonder though, however, because we've been running correlations about comparing the CPI and all these other indicators of democracy and control of corruption by the World Bank and even the Global Corruption Barometer. And even before 2012, the correlations were pretty good looking as well, right? Do we know exactly how much of a change took place after the methodological update? So in terms of how unreliable would the pre-2012 data be?
You mean in terms of like vis-a-vis what we have now?
Yeah, so I know
Or
that methodologically speaking, it makes sense to keep to the post 2012 data, right?
yeah,
But I wonder then what exactly is the risk? So how much
right. Okay, I
difference in
get
the
it.
results would we get if we look at the pre-2012 or we include the pre-2012 data? So how off would we end up?
So I don't think you would end up too off, because I think there's still a pretty high correlation between the data pre 2012 and post 2012. The problem was indeed that the index was not calibrated at the time in a way that so now we have a time limit, for example, on how old a source can be for us to include it in the CPI. If you look at, I don't know, just making this up, but if you look at the data from CPI 2000, it is possible that you would still have for some countries data from 1996, 97 that was recycled, right? And we also had data from that same year. So there is a lot of data that was recycled from one year to the next. Now, for every edition of the CPI, you have like a majority of sources that give us fresh data. There is still some recycled data from the previous year, but that's as far as it goes. So I think the data pre-2012 would be just laggier and less responsive to what's happening on the ground. And I think when I read a lot of the criticisms on the on CPI in the academic literature, I think that a lot of the criticisms that are being still cited today relate to the methodology back then in 96, and not necessarily to, they do not account for the changes that happened in 2012, and just keep citing, oh, yes, this person 96 said this, and then you just see that always the same citation, right? It's like, but that's no longer current. Why is this still there? And that has also, I mean, I guess that's what keeps me employed in a way. The fact that I need to keep fact checking this everywhere I go, right? It's like, but that changed already. That is no longer current. But anyway, as long as it pays the
I'm
mortgage.
fairly sure I'm responsible of making the same mistake, so let me apologize publicly. Beatriz, please go ahead.
Yes, actually, my question is related to what you just asked, Joseph. Hola, Roberto, fellow Latin American researcher here in Japan. So I was wondering if there has been any initiative or attempts from Transparency International to make the data before 2012 comparable, because it will actually be very useful for many young democracies to like gather our data from at least like before 2012.
Yeah, it would be great to make that possible. I think for us, the main restriction there is that the data that, like, a lot of the data that we use for the CPI is proprietary data, right? So it's not public data. Sometimes it's behind a paywall. And we got authorization to use the data for that year, but we cannot go back and access all of this data in retrospect to get all of this. So like we don't have access to the archive of data, right? So I did try at some point to see, okay, if I just use the openly available sources, would that make sense? Like, would I still have something that that is comparable? But it was not a very good solution, because you do see then a lot of jumps in scores once you add sources after 2012, right? So it was just statistical noise. But again, it doesn't matter how many times I tell people to please look at the confidence intervals in the CPI. If they see a jump of 4 points, it's like, oh my God, we're doing so much better. But yeah, would be great. It's in my it is in my ambitions list, but yeah, let's see if that is possible at some point.
So we are coming close to the end of the time allocated. I don't see any raised hands at the moment, so I'll assume that most of the key questions have been asked already. And I do feel that this session resemble more of an interview than a normal presentation. I don't know how you feel about that, Roberto, but at least I feel very satisfied that I was able to ask all the questions that I've been keeping for a number of years. And I'm very happy as well with the information. As I mentioned earlier, I'm probably also guilty of making the same mistake of criticizing the CPI for things that have been already corrected, or perhaps for things that are not TI's fault. As you mentioned, people make their own assumptions and expectations about what the CPI is supposed to be compared to what it actually is or what designed to be. So I'm really happy that we were able to kind of explore these points and make the record straight here. I would like to invite you perhaps of just if you want to take a minute or so to give us a last message, not just to us, but those who will be watching the video later on YouTube, about anything that we haven't covered so far about how to interpret CPR, what to think about it, or if you have a glimpse about what we can expect from TI and CPI in the future, that would be great as well.
All right. No, I mean, thank you for inviting me to this roasting. I really enjoyed it. So I'm happy I could answer most of your questions. I think from my point of view, what I keep trying to say to people is, as I started this presentation by saying, perceptions matter. They might not be a perfect reflection of reality, but especially if you're working in policy, I think people are the ones that you're trying to benefit. Those are the lives you're trying to change, and you need to have them on board. So keeping an eye on these perceptions matters. So there is obviously space in this sector for all of these other metrics that we love to discuss, and exciting data, and incorporating all of these different methodologies. I think there's a lot of space for that, but that should not come at the cost of ignoring the voice of people and the perceptions of people. I think my ambition, if I were to have this field reshuffled a little bit, I think I would love to see this field in a stage of maturity similar to what we have in economics, right? Where we don't criticize GDP because the Gini doesn't agree. Or because how come you have inflation, but you also have low unemployment? Like, this doesn't make any sense, right? So I think getting to that point where you can make sense of these different metrics, and instead of just blaming everything on a methodological flaw, so taking things at face value and see like, okay, this is all a different piece of the evidence puzzle that will allow us to then get to better anti-corruption results. I think for me, that would be a more, I want to say, constructive approach to corruption measurement than trying to get, and I think this is sometimes the feeling that I get, everyone is rushing to this like gold standard of like, what will be the ultimate anti-corruption metric? There is no need for that. I'm already there. I have the CPI. It's taken care of. Now we need to just enrich the environment and the context that we're in. So that's what I would like to see. And in terms of CPI, and what I hope you get to see in the future is this is going to be very depressing, but I hope you see a CPI in the future, because I think many of us probably take it for granted in the sense that it's just a certain death and Christmas coming every year. But we have started to see more and more issues with the data sources, in the sense that many of them are under pressure from funding. Many are having like issues producing the data that they were producing before. Last year, the Freedom House Nations in Transit was discontinued due to the US aid cuts. So I wish I could continue building the evidence base and continue building this like cross-time evidence base to see like historical, so to speak, record of like, okay, where were we in 2012 and how do we move until 2030, right? Would be great. But I think it would be important to also raise awareness in the sector that there is a lot of pressure on many of the agencies and institutions producing this data. Resources are short and not available. So nothing is certain anymore. That sounds very doomsday scenario-y. So I'm gonna have to ask you, Joseph, to like send us off with something more optimistic, because I'm just depressed myself.
I mean, yeah, I was gonna say, oh, a lovely message, and then you turned dark at the end.
It turned very sour. Yes.
But I think it's very important because indeed, as you said, I guess that we do take it for granted. For all the criticism, both either fair or unfair, we kind of expect that every year there will be a new update of the CPI, and I don't know how the community would take it if all of a sudden this were not to be the case. I think that everybody would then realize what a huge loss that would be. So, knocking on wood, that's not going to happen anytime soon. But that's an important message to send out there that, data don't just grow on trees, and we need to put an effort not just in collecting and analyze it, but make sure that it's sustainable in terms of funding and organizations that are involved in producing this primary data. So yeah, that's I guess not the happiest of messages, but a very important and powerful one. Did my internet now not jump? Okay, now I see at least someone moving. All right, so it wasn't me. Okay, you're back, Roberto. I see you moving now. As I was
Yes.
saying, powerful message. Again, not the happiest, but very timely as well, because indeed, our community is also going through a phase of global transition, and these type of efforts are potentially as or more important than ever. So thank you again for taking the time and donating your time to talk with us and to clarify all these questions. It was lovely talking with you and to hear this presentation about the methodology and result from 2025. I look forward to seeing what the CPI has to present next year from now. I mean, this is just very hot data out there. Still, people are going to be going through it. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you again on the next roundtable. Have a good morning.
Thank you, everyone.
Afternoon.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.